Very glad to speak with you all today. I am Jake Chervinsky. I'm CEO of the Hyperliquid Policy Center, and we'll be talking today about Hyperliquid and where things stand in Washington. And maybe some folks will trickle in, and I'll try to keep spirits up a little bit as everyone is settling back into work after lunch. I want to start by talking a little bit about what brought me here in the first place and why we're having this conversation. Obviously, everyone here understands the unique opportunity that Hyperliquid offers to revolutionize not just the global derivatives markets, but global finance. And I think to me, there are sort of three things that have come together at a critical moment that justifies the investment in policy engagement that the Policy Center represents. The first, of course, is perpetual futures, which is a new, innovative, and in so many ways better type of derivative than traditional futures, options, and swaps. The second is 24/7 trading, which is not unique to perpetuals, but is particularly powerful when combined with the benefits that perpetuals offer. And third, maybe most importantly, is the power of on-chain markets. That is the trading 24/7 of perpetual futures in a venue where all trading, clearing, and settlement happens on a public permissionless blockchain like Hyperliquid, with all the advantages that come from that blockchain, like security, resilience, transparency, and so many other benefits. And the problem, of course, as we'll get into in this conversation, is that despite all of that opportunity and all of those benefits, it is not currently lawful to trade on-chain perpetuals in the United States as a result of the regulations that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and also the Securities and Exchange Commission enforce. So that's what we're here to fix. For starters, just to drive home a point that you've been hearing all day, this is a massive market, and Hyperliquid is poised to capture that market. There is $200 billion of trading in crypto perps per day, $6.4 trillion traded on chain in 2025. Hyperliquid is the #2 venue behind Binance where that trading occurs. And if you compare this to the global derivatives market, it's still just a drop in the bucket. So there is a very long way to go. And this message has not been lost on Washington, D.C. Policymakers are talking about Hyperliquid all day, every day. And this happened really very recently. Hyperliquid burst onto the scene in Washington in a way that I think even us in this room did not expect. And now really is the moment for us not just to educate policymakers on what Hyperliquid is and what the opportunity is, but to achieve policy outcomes that unlock the power of Hyperliquid here in the United States. Because right now, as I said, Americans cannot lawfully access any of the benefits that we just discussed. And just to give a little bit of a history lesson to explain why we're in that situation, it isn't because there's some problem with perpetuals or with 24/7 trading or with on-chain markets. It's really a historical artifact of how the US derivatives laws came into existence. And those date back to the 1920s. In 1922 was the first bill that ever passed through Congress to regulate the derivatives markets. And back then, when they looked at derivatives market structure, what they saw essentially was a physical location, a place where a bunch of people got together and shouted at each other what they wanted to trade and in what amount and at what price. And they said that's an exchange. That place where buyers and sellers of derivatives come together is an exchange, and we're going to regulate it that way. And then at that exchange, there was one counterparty who was willing to shout at everyone else and take orders and fill those orders. It wasn't that every single person had to shout at every other person in the room to make peer-to-peer trades. And they said that person is the clearinghouse. That's the person who is the central counterparty to all the trading, and we're going to regulate them that way. And then, of course, not every person who wanted to trade a derivative was actually going to go down to the exchange, wherever that was. They would hire people to represent them who had an obligation to do right by them, to go on their behalf and enter orders for them. And those are brokers. And the legislation said we're going to regulate those folks as brokers. So you have these three types of intermediaries: an exchange, a clearinghouse, and a broker built into the federal statute that regulates these markets. And the same was true as legislation continued in the 1970s when the CFTC was created, and then in 2010 when Dodd-Frank, a very large piece of legislation which massively complicated regulation of derivatives, was put into law. But we are still stuck with that same market structure that we had over 100 years ago, trying to figure out how we apply those rules and regulations to something like Hyperliquid. This is why the Hyperliquid Policy Center exists. And so to tell you a little bit about what we are doing at the Policy Center, we launched about 5 months ago. We are an independent nonprofit research and advocacy organization. Our goal is to advance a clear, regulated pathway for on-chain markets to be accessed by Americans here in the United States, and also for the people who are building this technology, like the founders of Hyperliquid Labs, to be able to do that work here in the United States with the benefit of regulatory clarity. We were funded by a grant from the Hyper Foundation, but we are operationally independent and, of course, working very closely with many different folks in the ecosystem, many of whom are here today. We are a full team right now of 6 people. We're still growing. We do everything from communications to operations to events to government relations, lobbying, litigation, everything under the sun that you can imagine that needs to be done in Washington. We are here to do for the benefit of on-chain markets on Hyperliquid. And let me tell you a little bit about how that work gets done. And to get to the point, what are we doing in Washington? Where do we stand? And what needs to happen next in order to onshore perpetual futures on Hyperliquid? So first of all, there are 3 broad categories of policy engagement that we and any good policy shop in Washington will do. The first is research. We have to establish ourselves, and we are doing so, as the substantive experts on everything related to on-chain markets and the trading of derivatives, and especially perpetuals. So we spend a lot of time making sure that we have arguments that are backed up by both qualitative and quantitative analysis, something that is very important, especially in the crypto industry, where a lot of policy advocacy over the years has been informed by hand-waving and good vibes and less actual analysis. Second, education. The reality is that very few people in Washington deeply understand what a blockchain is, let alone what a perpetual future is, or why you would want an on-chain market for the trading of an instrument like that. Our regulators are really very sophisticated. The CFTC and SEC doing a very amazing job of understanding this. Folks on the Hill in Congress have had a lot less exposure. And what we need to do is to make sure that every policymaker who can touch any law or regulation that will affect Hyperliquid understands what the benefits are, and that is a challenge of education. But then third, and perhaps most importantly, is regulatory engagement. We work very closely with the regulators to figure out what extent to which they need to amend their rules in order to enable on-chain markets for perps and other instruments here in the US. We spend a lot of time with the CFTC and with the SEC. We also do spend a lot of time with members of Congress and their staff, especially as they are working on important legislation like the Clarity Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit when I invite my fellow co-panelists up to talk about what's going on in Washington right now. And then with the benefit of that strategy, here's what we are trying to accomplish in the US. There's basically 5 things we have to do if we want to get Hyperliquid onshore. The first is we need the CFTC to authorize the trading of perpetual futures writ large. And they have done that. Just about a month ago, the CFTC put out 2 orders, one for Kalshi and one for Coinbase, but both applying broadly to any registrant who wants to offer a market in a perpetual future, explaining that perpetuals with crypto underlying spot markets are permissible and can be treated as futures, meaning that retail traders can get access to them, as opposed to being treated like swaps, where they would only be available to institutional traders by and large. However, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the CME, which I would describe politely as a monopolist incumbent that is trying to use a regulatory moat to compete rather than launch good and innovative products, has sued the CFTC over that ruling. So even that first step of getting perps authorized in the US is still something that we're fighting about. Once we've done that, we also need the CFTC, secondly, to authorize the trading of perps on non-crypto commodities. Now, obviously, digital asset perps are great. That really is how perps were proven to be an effective and important financial instrument, going back to, let's say, 2016 with BitMEX, really proving out that perps work the way that we thought that they worked. But the most exciting markets for perps are not on crypto assets. They're on silver or oil or other types of commodities that we should be able to have markets for perpetuals trading in the United States. The CFTC basically said in its orders last month that they're open to the argument that there should be perps on physical commodities, but they're not convinced yet and more work needs to be done. So we are doing that work. Third, we go over to our friends at the SEC and we talk to them about perps where the underlying is not a commodity, where it's a security. And that could be for indices, it could be for single name stocks, it could be for any other type of security you could imagine. But we need to bring the SEC into this conversation and have them authorize the trading of equity perpetuals in addition to commodity perpetuals. We then need to get, number 4, 24/7 trading for those perps. And you might ask, how could you have a perpetual that doesn't trade 24/7? And the answer is, if the regulator demands that you shut down your market for perpetuals whenever ordinary market hours are closed. And that, I think, would be a massive detraction from the benefits of perps. So we also have to convince both the CFTC and the SEC that we should have 24/7 trading, which really is one of the greatest benefits of Hyperliquid, as we've seen over the course of the last handful of months. And then lastly, to put a whole lot into one box on this slide, we need to get the CFTC and SEC to authorize the trading of these perpetuals and settlement and clearing on chain, meaning on Hyperliquid. And thus far, in those orders that the CFTC put out, they only address the trading of perpetuals in a traditional centralized context where there is a registrant with total control over a traditional backend. And so we need to do the work to explain why settlement should be allowed on chain and not just off chain. So that's where we stand in Washington. The idea is, if we do this job right, what we will end up with is Hyperliquid onshore. Markets built by American founders who left the country because of regulatory uncertainty, coming back into the country so that everyone here can benefit from the technology that they've built. And we're making a lot of really good progress. I will both spare you the details and also maintain the confidence of the conversations that we're having with regulators and members of Congress in DC. But I will tell you overall, there is a huge amount of excitement about Hyperliquid specifically and on-chain markets broadly. And all you have to do to confirm that is to listen to any podcasts or any other appearance that Chairman Mike Seelig at the CFTC has done or Chair Atkins at the SEC has done over the course of the last few months. You will hear them talk about Project Crypto, which is the goal of upgrading all of the financial markets to bring them on-chain. And you will hear Chairman Seelig especially talking about the power of on-chain markets and the CFT's work to make sure that they are available here in the United States. So that's what I have for you today. I appreciate you listening to this conversation. There will be a lot more to talk about as the work goes on in DC. And to continue the conversation about what's happening right now in Washington in just a moment, we're going to bring up 3 amazing panelists for a conversation about the latest in DC. So stay tuned just a couple seconds, and thank you very much.